Yeah.
Excellent. Right.
We
Well,
are
thank you.
already, I see we are already recording, right?
Yes. Yep, I see that.
So, uh,
Thank you everyone for coming today to the first session that I'm leading for the Western Galilee College Holocaust Studies Program online seminar program. We've got a very exciting lineup of three speakers and a wonderful moderator in the form of Carson Phillips from the Azrieli Foundation, who's manager of academic initiatives out there, who I had the pleasure of working with at a conference recently. And today we're all focusing on new books in Holocaust studies. I think we've found that Holocaust studies is quite a prolific publishing field. There's always something new coming out. Just today, in fact, I got sent a new book that had come out in the last few weeks. So it's a really bustling and busy field. And so it's important, I think, for us to occasionally take stock of some of just some few of the things that have come out and think about the impact they're having on our field, but also then the future directions that we might have. So I'm very grateful to the panelists for joining us today and for everyone else for coming as well. And with that, I'll hand over to Carson to get us going, if that's all right.
Well,
we'll take questions in the end
Yep.
after the three speakers, not
oh,
each one, okay?
super. So, good afternoon, everyone. As you know, I'm Carson Phillips, and I'm with the Azrieli Foundation here in Toronto, where we are currently dealing with 60 centimeters of snow. So, winter has come with a vengeance for us in Canada, at least in central Canada right now. So, today is a welcome change to dive into some great academic topics and themes related to the Holocaust. And of course, we're going to hear from our three presenters today who will be discussing their work and their contributions to the historiography and academic work of the Holocaust. So we'll begin, and I'll sort of do a brief introduction, I suppose, of each speaker. And as was already said, we'll hold questions until each of the three presentations has taken place. Now, if I'm pronouncing anyone's names or university affiliation, I will apologize in advance and just blame it on my Canadianness of not being aware of other countries of grammar. So Svenja Bethke from the university, and I think it's pronounced Leicester, which I will credit Downton Abbey for having taught me to say it that way. Who will be discussing her publication, Dance on the Razor's Edge, Crime and Punishment in Nazi Ghettos. So exciting new developments in scholarship for us to hear about today. After, she'll be followed by Richard Breitman from the American University, who will be discussing his recent publication, A Calculated Restraint, What Allied Leaders Said About the Holocaust. And our third speaker today is Waitman Beorn from Northumbria University with his publication, Between the Lines, the Janowska Camp and the Holocaust in Lviv. So having said that, I welcome you all, and I will turn the floor over to our first speaker, Svenja.
Yes, thank you very much, Erev Tov Lekulam. I wanted to thank you for the kind invitation. I was flattered to be invited and also flattered my book was still seen as recent. A bit more on that later. And I'm excited to be part of this and to talk about my book. And I will say a few more words because I do think a lot has happened when it comes to internal ghetto communities. So I will maybe then update a little bit the state of research, but of course, we'll still make the point how my book contributed to certain developments and where we can maybe build on that. So I will actually start in Jerusalem. On my first archival visit, I was actually asked by the archivist when I asked, do you maybe have any collections in which I could find information about definitions of criminality or legal norms in ghettos during the Holocaust or during this time? She looked at me and she said, but there was no criminality in the ghettos. And a bit different, but similarly, when I presented in a German colloquium at a university in Berlin, I was confronted with the question or the comment that one could certainly not talk about any room for maneuver when it came to what the Jewish councils could do in the light of German brutality, violence, and ultimately mass murder. So when I was asking what room did they use to maybe define and judge on definitions of criminality, I was also confronted with some doubt if that was doable. So if these two people had been right, I could certainly not have written my book. That kind of accompanied me, and I was trying to come to grips both with the material that I could find and maybe also with these kind of initial questions or doubts. And I think these point to kind of wider assumptions that I will come back to later. So what I did do in my book then, which I also brought with me here, no slides today, but for those who haven't seen it, I'm trying to show that under violence, arbitrariness, and mass murder, the ghetto inmates that they were facing and the internal authorities in the form of the Jewish councils did actually discuss and classify which actions should be considered criminal, and they tried to persecute these and punish these internally. This was not always successful, as I will come to later. So my focus was on the perspective of the Jewish councils. I'm sure all of you will know, but for those who don't, they were established by force by the Germans, often shortly after the beginning of German occupation, and were then forced to fulfill changing German demands. They were hoping that by fulfilling these demands, they would be able to ensure the survival of the ghetto community. And after they were confronted with systematic mass murder by the Germans, they were hoping to at least save part of them. The Jewish council heads, despite their very different approaches and strategies, were constantly trying to understand what the Germans' intentions were, what the plans were, how these plans were changing, and try to basically, following that, come up with strategies, or we will later maybe discuss if these were really strategies. And of course, one was the use of labor in order to kind of satisfy German demands. At the core of my book lies the assumption that the dilemma of the Jewish councils condensed in a very specific way in what I call the ghetto internal legal sphere. So the Jewish council's definitions of what constituted criminal behavior was aimed at making sure the survival of the ghetto community and at regulating everyday life in these coerced communities. And this meant that the definitions of what constituted a criminal offense, in their view, the formulation of rules and the establishment of very improvised legal institutions were anchored always between the coercion to fulfill German demands and the desperate attempt to act as far as possible on behalf of the ghetto community. And of course, we all know that with time it became tragically clear that both could not be integrated. So there was only either or. So the room for maneuver that the Jewish councils perceived and found to a certain degree, depending on the time we're looking at, was kind of changing. And it was, of course, very much crucial at what point they knew what the Germans were intending to do, what the plans were, how the plans changed, etc., and what kind of survival strategies they could kind of formulate based on that knowledge. So in my book, I've compared several larger ghettos, the ghetto of Warsaw, the ghetto of Łódź, and the ghetto of Vilna. And I've done so because there was extensive archival material I could draw on. And I will now come to the kind of material that I've used for my book. So basically, this enabled me to draw on a very wide range. So my sources ranged from, because I considered also the German perspective and their idea of the criminal ghetto community, the criminal Jew. Come to that later. So I looked at reports and orders issued by the Nazis, the functionaries, communication between them and the Jewish councils. But the majority of my material was really the documents produced by the Jewish self-administrations in the ghettos and the discussions that they had on how to deal with certain behaviors within the communities. And as all of you will know, there's extensive material kept in the Ringelblum archive, for example, and then all the material for the Łódź ghetto, and similarly also material in the ghetto of Vilna in preparation for a comprehensive chronicle, for example. I also added some memoirs for key figures who played an important role in defining these new definitions, legal, personal, as I call them, and also internal court rulings. Now, later we will come to that point that only existed to a certain degree because, of course, there was always the fear that the Germans could kind of be made aware of certain things and intervene. So we have very different material because in some cases, consciously, there was kind of, they tried not to document certain things, and I will talk about that later. For the perspective of the ghetto inmates, there's of course the problem who talks about behavior that could be seen as causing dangers, being seen as criminal. But I did incorporate material that allowed me to see how ghetto inmates were referring to these new definitions of the councils. And I looked, for example, at letters, at petitions that were written to the Jewish council, basically, for example, explaining why when they were condemned or persecuted, they did not agree. And I was interested in how they basically made also use of certain institutions. So I've looked at two ghettos in occupied Poland, Warsaw and Łódź, that the Germans initially established as so-called provisional measure. And Vilna, of course, in contrast, was established in September 1941 after the attack on the Soviet Union, when the Germans had already started to systematically murder the Jews. So both Mordechai Chaim Umkowski, the Jewish council head in Łódź, and Jakob Gens in Vilna chose a survival strategy that today we know as rescue the work, or that's what they kind of called it at the time already. And as part of this, as we know, they were very willing to fulfill German demands, even at the time when that meant to hand over certain ghetto inhabitants to the Germans. In contrast, the Jewish council head Adam Chernyakov in the Warsaw ghetto committed suicide in summer 1942 when he was forced to hand over ghetto inmates for the German deportations. And despite these differences, I identified similar definitions of criminal behavior in all three ghettos due to the similar German demands that the Jewish councils were confronted with. And I will sum these up. So firstly, the Jewish councils defined offenses that were persecuted on explicit German orders, for example, illegal border crossings and smuggling. In these cases, the Germans also required the Jewish councils to hand over the offenders to the German or Polish police in some cases. And second, offenses that were classified as dangers to the ghetto community. And this was defined by the Jewish councils, and they saw that these behaviors could trigger the brutal intervention of the Germans. And here we could see some offenses that were rather unknown in pre-war times. For example, I found a lot of documents on the illegal production of sweets, or alternatively, the illegal production of sausages, meaning producing these things at home. They were strictly forbidden, and the reason was that the Jewish councils feared the outbreak of diseases and epidemics in the ghettos, and the fear was that in such a case there would be a higher danger for the Germans to intervene and basically murder the whole ghetto community. And this was already the case at an earlier stage of the ghetto's existence. So basically there was always this, if we do this, what may happen? And this was seen as one of the dangers. And further offenses that I would add here concerned the spreading of rumors, but also labor-related offenses, especially in the ghetto of Vilna. And third, offenses that were perceived as being directed against ghetto internal institutions, as the functioning of these institutions was seen as essential to ensure the survival of the ghetto community. Here, for example, the forging of ration cards to get food or undermining the authority of the ghetto police could be found. And as a fourth category, classical criminal offenses, as I call them, in which cases that individuals committed were persecuted, for example, fights between neighbors. I also found cases of sexual assault and even a few ghetto internal murders. However, I could show that with regards to such cases, and I'm referring to the latter, the priorities of the Jewish councils shifted. And especially once the Jewish council heads were aware of the systematic mass murder by the Germans, they prioritized the persecution of cases in which the actions of an individual could endanger the whole community. And overall, the specific and previously unknown offenses were mainly persecuted in the ghettos in which the Jewish councils followed this rescue through work strategy. Because here, this internal functioning and like following and enforcing their strategy was seen as kind of being key to secure the survival. So I furthermore show that Jewish councils established highly improvised ghetto internal legal spheres, what I call them. New definitions of criminal behavior were communicated, for example, via proclamations and newspapers in the ghettos. The Jewish police, of course, that we all know of, established on German orders, were also used to persecute internally defined offenses. And in addition, the councils, with the help of legal personnel, established courts where internal cases could be judged and internal prisons even, in addition to other forms of punishment. So there were kind of ghetto-specific ways to punish certain behaviors. And their main aim was to keep cases within the internal legal sphere, to kind of prevent the Germans from intervening and at least to be able to some extent to judge according to their own criteria. And for pragmatic reasons, some of these things were kind of tolerated by the Germans, and of course they also had an interest in kind of things staying calm. So there was some scope of action, even if that was just because it was at certain times not in the interest of the Germans to intervene. However, if the Germans intervened, of course they did often, it was arbitrary and often not foreseeable. In many cases, the Germans then intervened, of course, in very brutal ways. Often they allowed the councils to decide on some cases internally in front of the ghetto courts, only then to kind of choose these those convicted first when it came to deportations of ghetto inmates from the internal prison. So basically, they then first went to the internal prison to choose those. For the ghetto inmates, the criminal offenses, of course, constituted the individual survival strategies. And of course, scholars like Barbara Engelking and Jan Gombowski had researched this idea that, of course, a crime in the eyes mainly of the Germans meant survival for those committing it. So their notions of what was right and what was wrong, of course, drastically differed from those of the Jewish councils. But I want to show that there were also cases in which Jewish ghetto inmates made use of internal legal institutions and procedures to sometimes enforce their own interests. So at the core of my book lies the question of judgment of human behavior and often the question of morality. What should one do and shouldn't do in an unprecedented emergency situation? And the question of morality, of course, is something that comes up often in the context of Holocaust studies. And the period of course, National Socialism, Nazi occupation is, of course, associated with the complete absence of moral norms and legal norms. But of course, I think that we need to come to a deeper understanding how these changes happen. And as I show, for example, my first chapter, of course, the Germans believed themselves that they were still standing on the right side and kind of had their own new definitions of morality and law in place. And with regards to the Jewish councils, of course, Hannah Arendt is the most famous example who saw their actions as the darkest chapter in the whole dark story. I think that doing research on this dilemma of the Jewish councils and their perspective, of course, not started by me. We have the works of Isaiah Trunk. But when I started my research, there was not much else in terms of comparing the actions and the scope of action of the Jewish councils. And I think especially in this legal sphere or dealing with different behaviors, we can really see how this dilemma and like new judgments in terms of what is seen as right and wrong played out. And just to come soon to an end, I think another aspect, and that leads me then to where I see my wider contribution to the field with this. I first mentioned this comment of, but there was no criminality in the ghettos. And this was not only the archivist, but also someone like Samuel Gingos, who was a survivor of the Vilna ghetto, basically formulated this when he explicitly wrote very early about criminality in the ghettos and said that, basically there was none. First, the comments basically of the archivist and then also other voices. I think we have to ask how these definitions change in coerced and highly heterogeneous communities, and if maybe in these judgments of, but there was no criminality, there's always this idea of this being an objective category. And what I've shown in my book is that basically the way that this question of what is dangerous to the community, what is right and what is wrong in that context drastically changed, and that we see very different ideas and concepts of what constitutes dangerous and harmful behavior. And this leads me to my final point, which is the wider relevance. And a lot has happened since I first started working on this topic. And it's not a secret that the book that I've shown you and that Boaz has as well is the translation of my first book that came out in German. I did revise and update it when I published it in English. And a lot has happened. So when I started with the first project in 2010, there was not really much on this idea of everyday life in ghettos, or it was seen as something new. And there were many scholars setting out to do research on that. And since then, we have seen a lot of important works being published. For example, Anna Haikova's work on the last ghettos, or Teresin, or Katarzyna Persson, who wrote about the ghetto police. So many newer works look at these complex dynamics. They look at ambiguity, at ambivalence when it comes to how people behaved in the light of systematic mass murder, emergency situations, and so on. So my call now would be, of course, continuing to look at these questions of how did people try to create some kind of normalcy, strategies to survive. And I think now we really see a lot of research on case studies, and I still think that the comparative perspective really helps us to understand what life in extremes means and meant in this context. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Svenja, for this very insightful commentary about your book and your research. I'd like to bring in Richard Breitman next for his presentation and discussion on his research and publication.
Thank you for the invitation, and shalom. I was wondering whether I would be able to establish a link between Svenja's paper and mine. And I think if there is one, it's on this question of morality and moral judgment. In A Calculated Restraint, I examine, I think for the first time in comparison, what Allied leaders said about the Holocaust, which was a good deal less than they knew. And I thought that with comparison of the three major power leaders would be useful, in part because it shows that their behavior was more similar than dissimilar, and therefore one cannot really explain what they said based on individual character, because Churchill, Stalin, and Roosevelt were three very different people psychologically and politically. The book highlights three particular speeches. And when I first approached this topic, I thought that was going to be the bulk of my work. Those three speeches are featured in this book: Churchill's speech of August 24th, 1941, Stalin's speeches of November 6th and November 7th, 1941, and Roosevelt's press conference statement on March 24th, 1944. But in the end, I found that this was insufficient and that I really needed a continuous narrative that would reveal how they learned about the Holocaust, how they placed the Holocaust, or what we call the Holocaust, in the context of their view of the war, and what consequences their statements about the Holocaust had on the war. So, somewhat quizzically, I started with a chapter on Hitler because I thought I had some new information about Hitler's speech of January 30th, 1939, and I wanted to show that Hitler saw the war and the Holocaust as linked from the beginning and made his intention about a war against the Jews clear, independently of what Allied leaders did, both before and during the war. And as long as Hitler stayed in power, Germany would pursue the final solution. That interpretation is not universally accepted, but I believe it is compelling. And it has some serious consequences in terms of judging Allied behavior. You have undoubtedly heard that the maxim that the only thing that is necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing. And if you look at least one of the artificial intelligence programs, it says this is how we understand the Holocaust. And I argue this is not how one should understand the Holocaust, because the war and the Holocaust were directly linked, and those who were in charge of fighting the war were doing something, whether they were good men or not. Stalin obviously was not. So I, in the end, come to the conclusion that the Allies could have done more on the Holocaust during the war without impairing the war effort. But I tried to get away from extreme claims, such as the Allies had the capacity to end the Holocaust much earlier than it ended, or that the Allies could have saved millions of lives during the Holocaust with different policies. Some critics have given the impression, this is especially widespread outside of the academy, that the Allies could have stopped the Holocaust or reduced its extent greatly but lacked the will to do so. I do examine Roosevelt's press conference statement of March 24th, 1944 in considerable detail and its consequences because it contained a direct reference to the Holocaust in Hungary, which had not yet started when he made that statement. And it was an effort encouraged by the War Refugee Board to try to prevent the Holocaust in Hungary. It initially failed, and as we know today, the deportation of 438,000 Jews in a matter of weeks to Auschwitz was the most rapid destruction of Jews during the war. But Roosevelt's statement became the centerpiece of efforts by the War Refugee Board to interfere with the Holocaust, and it ultimately had some effect upon Admiral Horthy's decision to halt the deportations to Auschwitz in July of 1944. And that halt was of considerable help in the rescue or the survival of the majority of the Jews in Budapest. I do also examine schemes which others have raised as methods by which the Allies could have reduced the magnitude of the Holocaust, such as bombing the rail lines to Auschwitz and attempting to bomb the gas chambers and the crematoria. In the end, I came to the conclusion that neither one would have had much effect, even if they had succeeded, and the odds of blowing up the gas chambers and crematoria with existing planes and technology in 1944 were very, very low. In contrast, the slower, less explosive, if you like, methods of the War Refugee Board did have consequences in terms of helping the survival of Jews in Hungary. So if I were to sum up quickly, I would say the Allied leaders could have said more about the Holocaust during the war. They would have encouraged Jews not yet rounded up to try to escape or to go into hiding. They would have encouraged neutral countries to do more. And as a result, you can blame Allied leaders for not doing enough. But this is not the end of moral or practical judgment about Allied leaders. You also have to take into account the connections, the effect of the war on the Holocaust. Take into account the fact that you had three leaders willing to pursue this war to an end, and in the process, end the Holocaust. You had one of the three leaders, Roosevelt, willing to establish a rescue agency during the war, and Churchill willing to go along, somewhat grudgingly at times, but in cooperating with the War Refugee Board. And you had to consider the fact that the United States did not have to emphasize the war in Europe. It also had a war in Asia to deal with, and it was the Japanese who first attacked the United States. So American and Allied military strategy had an effect in terms of the duration of the war and the Holocaust, and we cannot assume that the war it would have inevitably ended on May 8th in Europe, 1945, regardless of what Allied leaders did. So I would think that any moral judgment of Allied leaders' behavior has to take into account their strategic decisions, some of which had direct effects on the Holocaust. In particular, the decision to invade North Africa in 1942 ended up saving hundreds of thousands of Jews in North Africa and more than 500,000 Jews in Palestine. And so I'd like to go back to that statement about good men doing nothing. The Allied leaders did something, even if it was only pursuing effective strategies during the war. And I take issue with those who have described Roosevelt as a villain or anti-Semitic or obviously deciding against the bombing of the gas chambers in crematoria. There's no written evidence connecting Roosevelt with that decision, but Roosevelt undoubtedly would have agreed with military strategy that was trying to end the war as quickly as possible. In the course of my research, I also uncovered one, I think, unknown statement that Roosevelt made shortly after establishing the War Refugee Board and before making that statement on March 24th, 1944. And I ended a calculated restraint in looking at anti-Semitism today. And then I quoted Roosevelt's statement. Let me read that paragraph to you. Some of the sources, this is a direct quote from a document written to Stephen Wise on February 9th, 1944. Some of the sources of anti-Semitism in this country, the United States, were created to serve Hitler's purpose. Let every American look to his own mind and actions so that while we defeat Hitler's armies, we also defeat his poisonous propaganda. Whoever condones or participates in anti-Semitism plays Hitler's game. There is no place in the lives or thoughts of true Americans for anti-Semitism. Thank you.
And thank you very much, Richard, for this very interesting and informative presentation about your research. I'd like to bring in Waitman Bourne, for our third and final segment and a discussion on his work and publication. So Waitman, I'll turn it over to you.
Great. I've got some slides because I feel like I need slides. So I'm going to share them. Hopefully, can everyone see that? Is it working? Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. Great. So I want to do a couple of things with the time that I have. The first is to sort of talk about very briefly about the history of the camp, and then some of the things that I think are significant about it, and then I'll close it with about a minute or two on a project that sort of has been spawned from the research itself. When I was looking about for a topic after I'd finished my last project, I went back to some of my notes, which were basically various court cases in Germany. And one of them was a court case of a German army motor pool unit that had used slave labor in the city of Lviv. And I thought, well, that might be an interesting topic. And the more I looked into it, I realized that these slave laborers came from this place called Janowska, which I had never heard of, to be quite honest. And I started looking into it more, and I realized that this is the book. This is the project that needs to be written. And so I certainly did not discover Janowska by any stretch. It's a really important place. Simon Wiesenthal and his wife are both prisoners there. It's there. Some of the sort of biggest celebrity survivors in a certain sense, people like Leon Wells, who testified at Eichmann, at the Eichmann trial, were there. So I was actually really surprised that there wasn't a sort of scholarly monograph that went through the history of it, and so I took that on. There are people, Thomas Sandkuhler, Dieter Pohl, have both written about it in book chapters, but it never got sort of its own dedicated look. And so my goal with the book was first and foremost to tell that story, which is a story that hasn't been told. It's sort of in a comprehensive way. And my sort of guiding focus, my goal, which I hope I came close to accomplishing, was really to live up to Saul Friedlander's challenge that we should be able to write an integrated history of the Holocaust that includes perspectives of victims, perpetrators, bystanders, and everyone in between, in a sort of comprehensive and cohesive, organic way. And so that was one of my number one goals. And then the other sort of way that I came at the project was in a spatial sense as well, thinking about telling the story of the camp at a variety of scales, from the individual scale of the body to the very micro scale of the buildings, the layout of the camp itself, but also the city, the region, and then ultimately the Holocaust itself. So I was very much informed by my wonderful experiences working with the Geographies of the Holocaust group and sort of geographic kinds of approaches. And so what I want to do now is kind of very quickly, or to the extent that I can do anything like this very quickly, walk you through a brief history of the camp. And then I'm going to talk a little about kind of some of the things that I think the book highlights that are important about Janowska itself, but also perhaps tell us something about the Holocaust as a larger phenomenon. So obviously, this is a very well-educated Holocaust audience, but just to give us a brief geographic orientation, of course, Lviv, Lemberg to the Nazis, is located in the last district to be added to the general government, District Galician, which is added in August, September 1941. The camp itself, and I'm going to come back to this in a minute, but the camp itself is established here, just near the Kleperov train station, which is a spur line to the main train station in Lviv, but also very much a part of the urban landscape, very close to downtown in the city. Lviv had the third largest ghetto in Poland with 160,000 Jews, so it's actually a very substantial place, and really deserves its own book on the history of the ghetto. Though I tried to include the ghetto as well in this particular book in my study as well. The Janowska camp itself is actually two separate camps, but most survivors and people talk about Janowska as kind of this organic element. It begins as a Deutsche Ausrüstungswerke camp, which is established in October, was established in the summer of 41. It becomes a closed camp in October of 41, run by a guy named Fritz Gebauer, with some tutelage by a guy named Mowinkel, who was from Lublin. He ran the Lipova number 7 camp in Lublin. This camp was established to basically build things for the Nazis, like furniture, pallets, wooden boxes, and do all the other kinds of labor. And it's established here on the grounds of a Polish railway workers community and a formerly Jewish-owned factory that had been abandoned sometime during the Soviet occupation. And you can see it's also right next to the Jewish cemetery, which had been there for quite some time, and you can tell by the sort of grid layout there. But Gebauer's second in command was a guy named Gustav Billhaus, actually. And Wilhaus, in a very bizarre kind of relationship, he had a very, like I said, extraordinary relationship with Fritz Katzmann, who was the SS and police leader for Lviv. He was a general. And together they plotted the establishment of their own camp, and that is the Zwangsarbeitslager Lemberg, which is often what people talk about when they talk about Janowska. And it's established literally right next door to the Deutsche Ausrüstungswerke. Gebauer and Wilhaus did not get along, but Wilhaus is beneficiary of all of the power and prestige from Katzmann, because Katzmann also wants to corner the market on slave labor, to curry favor with Himmler, because Himmler is very interested in a series of camps building a highway across Ukraine. And so the Zwangsarbeitslager really overshadows the DAW, and it's also a place and it's something that one of the sort of takeaways I think from the research is it was very much a sort of amateur hour kind of place, which I think explains some of the really incredible cruelty and brutality that you get from the survivor sources. What's interesting from a source perspective is that there's very little in terms of Nazi documents about this place. Almost all of the sort of detailed work on this is survivor testimony, comes from post-war perpetrator work, and these kinds of things, which is kind of an interesting flip in sort of your average Holocaust work. This is just another layout of the camp, using some of the 3D imagery that I've built as well, to give you sort of a sense. It's a very, very small place. It's around 40 square acres or something like that. It's not very big at all, but it's very important. One of the reasons it's important, I think, is it's an urban camp, and I mentioned this earlier. And here you can sort of see on a Luftwaffe aerial photograph, it's located right downtown. It's a 20-minute walk from downtown Lviv today, if you go and visit. And this had some really important implications, particularly for the inmates of the camp, because on the one hand, they were able to benefit from a self-help organization established in the ghetto. They were local, they knew the city, which gave them opportunities that prisoners, Jews in other concentration camps didn't have the same kind of opportunities, because they were sort of plopped in the middle of a foreign area. Also, it had a negative in the sense that quite often the Nazis in the earlier stages of the camp could, for example, murder your family if you escaped. And so there were pressures against escape as well, even though, as we'll learn, there were lots and lots and lots of escapes from this place. One of the things that I've always thought is important about this particular camp is sort of how diverse it was in terms of its purposes. There are lots of camps in the camp system that did one or two of these things, or one of these things at a certain time. But Janowska was a slave labor camp, a transit camp, and a dedicated killing site throughout its entire existence. These sort of three functions were happening concurrently. The slave labor camp provided slave labor for a variety of purposes across the city, as well as within the camp itself. Here's a really amazing photograph taken by a prisoner of prisoners destroying the Jewish cemetery, with a German labor company's name right there on the truck. Again, the transit piece is really important both for the city of Lviv. Jews were deported from the city itself to the camp before being sent to Belzec. And here's an image of that happening via the city streetcar, which is quite extraordinary. But the camp itself also served as a transit camp for the region of Galicia. Jews were sent in from various ghettos and camps in the region. They were taken off the train to serve as labor, both in Janowska and elsewhere. And prisoners from Janowska were put on the train to go to Belzec and sometimes Sobibor as well. It also served as a transit camp for the property of those murdered in Belzec, which often came back to Janowska to be processed either for sale further on or being sent to Germany. And lastly, it was a dedicated killing site from the very beginning. The ravines, the Piaski ravines behind the camp, were used as open-air shooting pits from really before the camp even existed, when the Einsatzgruppen arrived in July, all the way up until liberation in July of 1944. And to give us a sense of the numbers, and here you can see some of the sites, by the way, using that aerial photograph from 1944. Somewhere around 80,000 people, as many as 80,000 Jews, predominantly Jews, are murdered in the sands behind Janowska. And we obviously don't play the sort of suffering Olympics of which place was worse than another. But if we're taking these numbers, that's actually more Jews murdered in Janowska than at Majdanek. And Majdanek is often put up there along with the Reinhard camps as a dedicated extermination center. It's obviously far more than places like Buchenwald, Dachau, Bergen-Belsen, et cetera, et cetera. So it's a really significant place in its own right as a killing site. And during the times in which Belzec was not functioning, so during the summer of 42, when the gas chambers are being renovated, and then after it closed, most of the killing then shifted to Janowska. So Janowska sort of stood in as a backup killing site for the Jews of Galicia. And also, I mean, one of the things I think is really fascinating and important about Janowska is you can almost tell every story of the Holocaust using this one particular place. So we have all of the horrible things that are happening. We have all of the persecution, victimization, sexual violence, torture, et cetera. But we also have incredible acts of resistance. In November of 1943, the Jews of Janowska in two different locations, the camp itself and also the Sonderkommando 1005 site, rose up, killed SS men, and staged mass breakouts, which again is, I think, a really important story to be told as well. And of course, the Sonderkommando 1005 piece is also important. Janowska served as the training site for the Sonderkommando 1005, which was the project of going back and eradicating all evidence of Nazi killing. The SS came there, they established a school there, and people would come for 10-day courses and then go off to carry that out throughout the occupied East. Again, it also served as really the star in the second largest post-war German trial after the Frankfurt-Auschwitz trial, which was the Lemberg process in Stuttgart, which also, in a quite rare choice, has a written transcript of 10,000 plus pages, which begs more investigation as well. Today, it's still a prison. The site continued to be a prison from the moment it was liberated by the Soviets. They used it as a prison for their people, and then it was a Ukrainian prison. And after independence of Ukraine, it is still a prison today. And ironically, it manufactures furniture and some of the same things that the DAW did back in 1941. And you can sort of see here again. Here's the footprint of the modern prison, and it maps almost perfectly onto the Zwangsarbeitslager from 1941. Most of the buildings no longer exist within that prison complex, though the camp headquarters building does. So let me talk about some thoughts on the significance of the camp. As I've mentioned, I think it's significant in its own right. It's a story that needed to be told, that hadn't been told in that level of detail. It also tells a story about resistance. There's lots of examples that I haven't covered here from time, but that really extraordinary stories of both individual and group resistance to the Holocaust. And one of the things that I think is also really quite important is the network piece. And there's only a chapter in the book, but I want to highlight it very quickly here, which is that these men knew each other. The SS men very much knew each other. There were two clusters of the Waffen SS men who had all grown up within 60 miles of each other in the Banat region of Hungary and Serbia, and in Silesia. Some of them had worked in the same factories before the war, which I thought was really fascinating. And then if you map this out, which is something I did in the process of the research, you can see the places that they overlapped, places they had served before, places they served together afterwards. And in many ways, they become a sort of group of colleagues who then work together, even during the liquidation of local camps and ghettos throughout Galicia, of which, and here you can see, don't worry if you can't read all of this, but these are all guards, and these are all the places in elsewhere in Galicia, in District Galician, that they worked. And so sometimes when a smaller ghetto was to be liquidated, they would literally call up their colleagues in Janowska, who would go out and liquidate the camp, and then they would go back and continue working at the camp. So there's a lot of really interesting suggestions about transfer of expertise, if you will, but also what those relationships meant for the final solution in District Galician. And so that's something I just wanted to highlight. And again, resistance, I think, is something that Janowska does a really great job of highlighting, both individual, group, and organized from the outside as well as from the inside. There are lots and lots of escapes, which take place throughout. And again, something we could perhaps talk about during our question and answer period. And I'm going to finish here with 1 minute on a project that was sort of spawned from the book itself, and I think speaks to the spatial focus of the book, and that's the Visualizing Janowska project, which is an AHRC funded project that I'm currently sort of at the final stages of, which is an attempt to build a digital reconstruction of the camp itself from survivor testimony, survivor drawings, photographs, and all kinds of other sources. Because the camp itself you can't visit, doesn't exist anymore. And this project has really two goals. One is to think about all of the sort of intellectual, ethical, methodological challenges that we have when we're creating and trying to reconstruct a historical place in a virtual world. So that's kind of the academic side. But there's also going to be a public-facing platform where visitors can digitally visit the site and engage with primary source documents, survivor testimony, video testimony, while at the sort of virtual site itself. And then, of course, thinking about what we can learn from that process as well, which I think might have some very useful findings for other sites, other places that, like Janowska, are simply sort of unknown in the larger understanding of the Holocaust. So I will stop there. Again, thank you so much also to Boaz and to Western Galilee for inviting me on.
And thank you for this very interesting presentation board. If you have questions, anyone who's in our sort of virtual audience this evening, if anyone has questions, please feel free to put them into the chat box. You could type them in and we'll see them come up. Alternately, you could raise your hand and perhaps we'll notice it. But if you can put it into the chat box, that would be greatly appreciated. We do have some questions that have come in already. The first one for Professor Breitman. Oh, my screen just moved, so I have to move it back down again. How much did the Allied leaders figure into their decision, the anti-Semitism in their societies when making their proclamations?
Of course, we have to infer from what they said or what they did not say. But there's no question that the psychological warfare experts in the United States and Britain preferred to have general statements about Nazi atrocities and not specific statements about Nazi atrocities against Jews. And that was in part for, well, let's call it foreign policy reasons, especially while the war in North Africa was going on, but also domestically, they had to consider the fact that there was widespread anti-Semitism, not a majority of the population, but a substantial minority of the population, and that was a political factor. It certainly was a factor in limiting immigration in both the United States and Britain.
Great, thank you. Our next question goes over to Svenja. Thank you for an intriguing presentation. Did you find evidence of organized crime in the ghettos that you researched?
Thank you so much. And I think I should also thank you for your review, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, very good question, because actually there were discussions, and that's what I found so interesting. There were quite often these continuities when it came to certain networks, and especially, for example, in the Warsaw Ghetto, people who kind of had already worked together prior to the war, and then played a role in organized smuggling. Of course, we always have to differentiate between like individual smuggling, but then there were also kind of groups that organized their efforts maybe in slightly different ways. And again, with my approach, of course, I was mainly interested in how it was discussed, and at what point did people see it as kind of just the individual level or organized. And I think one of the considerations was always, did they do it to enrich themselves beyond kind of smuggling food to survive, or did they want to kind of gain more out of it? So I think questions of solidarity also played a role when it came to these judgments, what was seen as okay and what wasn't seen as being okay in the way it was discussed in the community. Thank you.
Well, Svenja, we're going to stay with you for a couple of moments because it's a two-part question, so I'll give you the two parts at once. Why did you specifically choose the three ghettos that you did, Warsaw, Łódź, and Vilna? And what criteria, such as source availability or administrative differences, played a role in your selecting of these three particular ghettos? And the second part to this question, did the people in the ghettos view the Judenrat courts as just, or did they resist them?
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, the first question specifically, my former supervisor would like this question because he wanted me to also include small ghettos. So of course, as I said, these are all large, and the main reason was the availability of sources, of course. And I did really look into, could I do anything, including smaller ghettos by looking at Yiscor books or other sources. Why I then focused on these was that I was really interested in these different perspectives and perceptions of what was happening, and I felt anything else. I mean, I think I do have very few references on examples I found in my desperate attempt to maybe include less institutionalized ghettos, but I have to say it was a bit of pragmatism, and then it was also, I found so much on these that I thought maybe later I would write something on smaller ghetto examples, but that's the main reason. And the second question, very good question. I do have one chapter on the perspective of the ghetto inhabitants, and of course they perceived the court as kind of expressing what the Jewish councils thought was criminal, which very much conflicted with their own perception. So no, they did not like the courts at all. They saw them similarly as they saw the ghetto police, the Jewish police, so kind of as standing on the other side. However, and this is what I looked at as well, in some cases, I mean, they testified in some cases they also like pushed for certain kind of internal proceedings to happen. And there was also in some cases revenge that played a role. They wanted to take revenge against someone because they felt that was a way. So this is what I was interested in. It like, when did it matter, in which way? But to answer this overall, no, they were not liked, of course.
Waitman, let's turn over to you for a moment. I have a question. How do you explain the relative ignorance about Janowska, especially as you've been describing in your presentation this afternoon, its prominence and its death toll?
It's a really good question, and on the one hand, it's kind of perplexing because, like I said, it had some prominent survivors, not least of which was Simon Wiesenthal, who dedicated much of his life to trying to find the commandants of the camp that had been in charge when he was there, right? And he writes about that. And also, as I said, it figures prominently at the Eichmann trial. There are a couple photographs from the camp that are all over sort of the Holocaust in terms of textbooks and things like that, particularly of the orchestra and the bone grinders from the Sonderkommando 2005. But I think the other piece of it, it's a place that is behind the Iron Curtain. The Soviets, it's in Soviet territory. There's not much to it when they get there. It's not Auschwitz. It's not sort of a sprawling sort of complex. There are very, very, very few Jews left in Lviv, or even to come back to Lviv to be interested in it, because most of them are murdered. And I think there's also the Cold War, issues that lots of the Holocaust behind the Iron Curtain suffers from anyway. And then Janowska just happens to be sort of even more out of the way, out of place. Though again, I think it's crazy in the sense that it does occupy this massive trial, which does not go without notice in Germany. I mean, it's lots of publication in the newspapers, etc. But I think it's a combination of all of those things, some of which are common to all the sites behind the Iron Curtain, that only in the last, I would say, 15 to 20 years have really gotten the same amount of focus as the Western camps have.
Great, thank you. We're going to go back to you for a moment, Svenja, with the question, what crimes did you find figure in all of the ghettos that you compared?
Yeah, a very good question, of course. So to turn it a bit around, I think it was specifically, as I said, in Vilna and Łódź, that these kind of offenses where something was seen as potentially being a danger or leading to dangers for the community, and this kind of category of directed against ghetto internal institutions, that these only kind of happen in Łódź and Vilna, and those that kind of occurred in all three ghettos were the explicit German kind of definitions, like illegal border crossing, smuggling, also then later anything that related to like work-related, labor-related offenses. They occurred, and then what I called classic criminal offenses. Of course, there were kind of variations as to what happened, but when certain kind of conflicts arose, and in very rare also internal murder cases. So these are the ones that kind of were shared categories. Thank you.
Thank you. We're going to go back over to you again, Beorn, for a two-part question. In a recent podcast, you discussed briefly the women's camp section. Were the female guards there trained at Ravensbrück and moved to Janowska from larger camps with the group of prisoners? And with its relatively early liberation, were there death marches from the camp in the later stages of the war?
It's a fantastic question. There were no female camp guards actually at Janowska. The women's camp was established in 1943. It was 6 barracks, so it wasn't huge. It was guarded by men. And there's actually, again, there's some really amazing stories of resistance. I'll tell one very quickly. In the women's camp, there was a particular SS guard who would go in there and essentially assault the women. And the women contacted some of the men in the resistance, and together they essentially built a bear trap. And so the next time this guy walked in, he basically stepped into a trap with spikes that got him in the leg, and he never went back in the camp. Which I thought was really a fascinating story. So there were no women guards there, again, because this place is actually, Janowska was never actually officially a concentration camp until January 1944, when it became officially part of the Maidanic subcamp system. But it was never under the Inspectorate of Camps and Ghettos until that point. So it was out of sight, out of mind, no adult supervision, if you will, which I think explains a lot of the violence there. The second question is a great one as well. So it's liberated in July of 44. Really fascinating story, very quickly. There were death marches of a kind. The second commandant was a guy named Friedrich Wartzak, and he evacuated the camp along with the survivors of the two escape attempts that were still there. And partially in trucks, partially in marches, they began evacuating to the west. Wartzak invented a very important commando, a detail that was supposed to go around building fortifications, because he and the SS men didn't want to get conscripted into actually fighting in the war. And so during part of this death march, and Wiesenthal was part of this as well, the prisoners literally would kind of just sit around, pretending like they'd paint signs saying this is the Sonderkommando, this is the Bau Brigade of whatever. That happened for a month or so, and then the remaining prisoners were split up and sent various places. Płaszów, some to Auschwitz, some to other places. So there were death marches, but they were very small, because by that point the prisoner population was actually quite small.
Great, thank you. Richard, we're going to go over to you with a question. Related to the issue of popular anti-Semitism, how would you assess popular knowledge of the Holocaust during the war? We've seen a good deal of critical comment about the New York Times as a vehicle of information, but little about the hundreds or even thousands of local papers that existed in the US.
I have looked briefly at newspaper coverage, but I don't regard myself as the expert on the topic. There was a fair amount published. It was usually not as prominent as we would think it appropriate today. But there certainly was a good deal published by the middle of 1944, some copies of the Auschwitz protocol emerged first in Switzerland and then eventually in the United States. And there were newspaper articles, relatively prominent newspaper articles in major newspapers, including the Times. So the information was there, but it wasn't always absorbed, and it wasn't always given great priority. So there were plenty of Americans who had their minds on other things and were shocked at the photographs and the films that emerged about the Holocaust at the end of the war.
Richard, I'll follow that up with you with a second question from another participant here today. Notwithstanding latent anti-Semitism in the Allied home nations, how big of a factor was just sheer disbelief and incomprehension in explaining Allied inaction, for example, the bombing of any of the camps?
Okay. I was looking to avoid details on the bombing, but let me give you at least some. First of all, the Allies could not have bombed any of the extermination camps until late spring, early summer of 1944, when they had a base, an air base in Italy to get to Upper Silesia. Auschwitz-Birkenau was the only extermination camp in operation then. The pressure for bombing came primarily because of the deportations from Hungary, and as I indicated in my presentation, those deportations stopped in July of 1944, which meant that when the issue reached certain officials in London, they said, well, those deportations aren't going on anymore. Of course, there were other trains from other places and other victims, but the political pressure, what there was of it, came with regard to the Hungarian, the Holocaust in Hungary. The difficulty of bombing the gas chambers and crematoria has been widely underestimated, except by military historians. I spoke in some detail with Ed Westerman, who these days is a Holocaust expert, but in an earlier life, he taught at the Air Force Academy and is a pilot himself. And, you know, precision bombing was a misnomer in those times. It was difficult to get within a few miles of a target, and the squadrons released bombs altogether, which meant that only the lead bomber could aim at a particular target, and others were following at various distance behind. And there's now a good article by Joe White, unfortunately no longer with us, which argues that the guards at Auschwitz-Birkenau used to punish prisoners anytime there was bombing in the vicinity. And certainly the Holocaust continued with killings by other means after Auschwitz-Birkenau's gas chamber was shut down. So the most you can argue with bombing is that if it somehow succeeded, it would have reduced the efficiency of killing, but not ended the killing itself.
Great. Okay, thank you very much for that comprehensive response. I don't see any further questions coming up in the chat function. So perhaps since this is a good time to turn it back over to Boaz.
Yes, I have. While Dr. Verena Buzer is not with us, I mean, she's with us, but she's not running the seminars anymore. So we are really thankful for what she did, Daniela, and really happy that Barnabas took this role, and we can see an amazing seminar. And so thank you all. I will use the chance of having the chance to say a few ending comments. First, I was looking for a joint thread here. And I think what we showed in a new book or recent book, actually, Svenja, we try to be more careful, but we are happy you are here. That we actually, if we look at the ghetto as the Jewish victims, but we are not talking about agency in the ghetto, we are not talking about victimhood, we are talking agency of the judges and agency of the criminals. So it's not a story about agency, but it's the victims of the Nazis. So that's the microcosmos. Then we have the perpetrators, the final solution, and this is what we saw with the Waitman's work. And we had the international politics view, the larger circle. So actually we grew. We have a full description of what this can be. I want to say just a few comments. First about Janowska. I wrote a lot about Philip Friedman. And he starts his story. He meets this lady in the Legionnaire Boulevard in Lviv, and he opens his bag. He said, "I'm going to fight Hitler by talking about the Holocaust." And here I have a testimony of a young man from Janowska. So that always comes. So people were looking at it, also collecting testimonies very, very early. Another issue is talking about criminality in ghettos. Actually, I can't understand anyone who thinks otherwise. First of all, we know it is well, at least in contemporary sources that the underworld saved the Warsaw Ghetto, in the sense of they knew how to smuggle food. All these films, German films, where there were children who smuggle in their underpants and stuff. To feed hundreds of thousands of people, you need to do massive bribery and smuggling inside. And this was done by the people who knew how to do it. And they also got paid for their troubles. So the whole issue of underworld in the ghetto is, I think, very, at least when we teach Warsaw Ghetto, this is another thing that we teach. And I think we should not make everyone into angels. If we look at Mark Dworzecki work, and he's talking about the ghetto as a place where the beast in man was unearthed. Like, did we meet the moral expectations we had of ourselves? He asks this right after the Holocaust. In a very early version, he also gives a list: prostitution, and I mean, he has a very big list of things that weren't okay. So I think even in the Haggadah of Pesach, we use a verb, I'll say it in Hebrew and then in English, Vayareu otanu Mitzrim. The Egyptians made us bad. That's how the sages understand this pasuk. When you are in extremis, it doesn't bring out the nice part of you. And the fact that there was a part of solidarity and help, and people were not all criminals, and even some criminals has the golden heart. This is maybe even the exception, or at least the not natural response we would have waited for. And lastly, I want to, we always finish every time we talk about the war and the Holocaust in these seminars. There's an argument between me and Yaron, who's teaching now, about Allied decisions that had fatal results for the Jews, like the decision to continue the war, like the no surrender decision. I think it was a right decision strategically. Otherwise, we would have had another World War I and the end of World War I story. But the Jews who were in the camps, they paid the price. So this is an issue we always discuss. And I will end by reminding us of there's a book. The number one journalist, actually a survivor, escaped Warsaw Ghetto and got to Palestine. He was meant to go to when you needed to write about the fate of European Jews during the war in the papers. This was Moshe Prager. And in 1947, he publishes the first comprehensive book on the Holocaust. It's so unfamous that I missed it in my PhD in the book, so I apologize to him. But he said something very important. He said the tragedy is that the Allies understood the Holocaust or the final solution as something totally separate from the war. Like it's two stories. We have a war to fight. The Germans are fighting us, and they're also killing Jews. Okay, we'll do what we can if we want to. But for the Jews, the whole war was a matter of life and death. The war was on them. It was not two stories. It was one story. And I think this is a very important point to ponder. So thank you, all of you, very much. And we'll see you all next time. We will, in February, have something that is emanating out of our Children in Crisis yearly workshop in Germany. So we'll have an evening on the on child rehabilitation with children of 7th October, because that's a workshop on child rehabilitation, starting with the Holocaust and ending with contemporary issues. And after that, you will hear from us. I will also say that we spoke here a minute before people came in about our innovation international course, and so I will say something about this. I will take the just a minute. So I will share my screen for a minute. We are having now, there's a small argument whether this is the 6th year of the 5th year, but probably the 6th year. We are doing this international conference, international course. We had the honor of having Barnabas as one of our early students in the course. It's a very unique course. We have students from already, people signed up from 12 countries. It's also a very diverse. We have people from different fields in academy. We have young graduate students or even BAs, and then we have established professors, and we have laymen who are interested in this. And we don't give lectures in this course, hardly, lecture. It's all about doing, like it's a project-based learning course. We teach people to do startups in Holocaust memory, and we teach it by building startups in Holocaust memory, low tech, high tech. You don't. We have cards, study centers, also, and we have computer games, all sorts of stuff that people are suggesting. In the end, we have a pitch and teams which are international. The teams bond in the course. So during the 13 meetings of the course, you bond into you coalesce into international teams. Then people, each team adopts one idea from all those that people suggest, and we work with them throughout the course. And in the end, they pitch a proof of concept of the idea to a panel of experts. We don't have the sharks really because we don't give money, but we do have representatives from USHMM, Ghetto Fighters, Yad Vashem if they join up, and people from the high-tech industry too, and the students present their project. So if you have any interesting, any students that could be interested in this, the barcode will give you a chance to go into a place you can see an interview with Barnabas about his studies and with other students from Hungary, Israel, whatever. And so spread the word because we are starting in March. So this is the time to get your students, your friends, yourselves to enroll in this. Thank you very much. Good night.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.